Are savers losers? That is the big question for today. Let's dive in. Welcome to Heresy Financial, everybody. My name is Joe Brown. This is the channel where we talk about financial topics in a way that's considered heresy to the financial establishment. Today we're discussing the question whether savers are actually losers. Now, this is a term, savers are losers is a term that was made popular by Robert Kiyosaki. He uses it a lot. He has a lot of videos and talks where he says it, and it was in his book that made him famous in the first place, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Now, this didn't used to be the case historically, but recently it is becoming more and more true over the last few decades. So the reason why savers are losers is because of inflation. Now, if you put $10,000 in your savings account, that might be enough for a couple months worth of expenses as a rainy day fund or as an emergency fund. Some people who don't trust the stock market, especially millennials right now, are just stocking up on a lot of cash because maybe they want to buy a house. You know, they're thinking that the housing market is going to collapse, in the next recession. So they're stockpiling up a lot of cash so that they can buy a house for cheap, like a lot of people did who had cash, 10 years ago. They might also not trust the stock market because, again, they looked at what happened 10 years ago. Maybe they had parents who had retirement accounts that were wiped out. And so there are a lot of, especially millennials right now and baby boomers, who are stockpiling cash. They don't have it invested. But even if it's just a rainy day fund, even if it's just a savings account for, a couple months worth of expenses, an emergency fund, you might have some money in the bank that you're saving. And what that is doing is it's basically ensuring that you lose purchasing power. And here's why. Over time, just in the normal environment, just normal economic environment, cash, dollars, currency, paper currency, loses value. Now, you might be in a savings account that is paying you a certain interest rate. You might be getting, a 0.5% or 1%, or some banks for a while were even going up to 2% over the last year or two. A lot of that was in expectations that rates would continue to increase. Well, as of December, everybody realized that's not actually happening as they paused the rate hikes and now they're lowering them again. Now it's pretty much a broad consensus that rates are going lower. Now, what this means is inflation. We're going to see lowering interest rates. We're going to see money printing. We're going to see the government spend more and more and more money, and their deficits are going to increase because of that. And that deficit is funded by creating debt that the Federal Reserve turns into a treasury. They buy that debt up. It's called monetizing debt. And essentially, they allow the U.S. government to pump money into the system wherever the government wants to spend that money by absorbing that debt. And so that's inflation. That's new money being printed because the Federal Reserve is the one that prints that money to purchase that debt, to fund that deficit that funds that spending. And so that's inflation. That's new money coming into the system, which expands the money supply. That's the definition of inflation, the expansion of the money supply. And when that happens, that will bid up the prices of goods and services. Now, over the last 10 years, we didn't see a lot of prices of goods and services go up. And that's because central banks all around the world absorbed all of that inflation. They purchased a lot of debt from the United States as an emergency measure. Now, central banks are realizing that it was never a plan to unwind that. It was never just an emergency measure. It is now business as usual to keep that and expand that balance sheet. And so central banks around the world are starting to unload U.S. treasuries. China, Russia, especially, those are the biggest ones. And it's significant that the fact that they stopped buying treasuries and are now starting to net sell treasuries. And now the Federal Reserve is going to have to make up the difference. And the Federal Reserve will do that by printing dollars. And so as this happens more and more, we are going to see all that inflation start to come back. The result and the effects of that inflation start to hit our store shelves, start to hit rent prices, start to hit gas prices. Anything that is priced in terms of dollars will start to climb. And so this is not business as usual. We're entering into a new phase where the dollar starts to lose value very quickly. Especially against the prices of goods and services. Maybe not against other currencies, because there's a currency war starting right now where everybody's trying to devalue their currencies against each other. But as inflation takes off, as the US government's debt is monetized, as central banks start to sell treasuries and the Federal Reserve has to step in and become the last buyer of treasuries and allow the US government to print more, spend more and more money, the Federal Reserve will print more and more money in order to fund that, and our money supply will expand exponentially. So the value of every dollar goes down in proportion because there are not the same number of goods and services being created in addition to that money that's being created. That means that there will be an imbalance, and prices of goods and services will go up as all that new money is created. I always use the Monopoly example. If you replace everybody's $5 bills for $500 bills, nobody will want to do business for $5 anymore. Everybody's rich, so that means nothing. So you'll bid up the prices of everything else, of your rents, your hotels, your houses, and your utilities and the properties, because $5, $10 is meaningless. Everybody has tons of 500s, so why would you do business for less? It doesn't, and it's just a chain reaction. It doesn't happen immediately, but over time, and especially as the pace of that inflation increases, the prices will skyrocket in reaction to that. And so we're about to see this inflation take off. And so the term that savers are losers, being true in the past 10, 20, 30 years, it was true. Because you've seen, if you would have put your money in a bank account, it would have not grown on pace with the amount of costs of goods and services. That's going to be more and more and more true as time goes on. And especially as rates go lower, you're not going to be getting paid interest on that bank account. In fact, a lot of people, I just wrote a blog post about this today at heresy.financial. You can go check it out. I'll link it in the description below. But pretty much everybody now expects that zero rates or negative rates will come to the U.S. Alan Greenspan and I believe Ben Bernanke, both former chairmen of the Federal Reserve, they've both talked about this, that zero and negative interest rates are basically on their way to the U.S. It's only a matter of time. And in terms of real interest rates, instead of just the number, in terms of real interest rates, you calculate that by looking at the real inflation. We might be there already. And so when you look at what you're getting paid on your cash, just to hold cash in a bank account, you're getting paid very little, if anything, right now, and soon it'll be negative. You'll be charged to hold your money in a bank account in the form of fees, right? So very, very soon here, you're going to see that become widespread. You're going to see that become, across the board. That's going to be the new normal, and debt will become more and more of a viable and a profitable thing to be in debt. Because especially countries like Denmark right now is experimenting with this, where you have, basically you get paid to take out debt. And when you take into account real inflation right now, you're basically already getting paid depending on the type of debt that you have. A mortgage right now, you're going to see your dollars lose value faster than the interest rate on that mortgage. And so as the nominal rates get lower and lower and lower, that's going to become more and more and more true as the government tries to stimulate the economy. Now, Ray Dalio, founder and manager of Bridgewater, the largest hedge fund in the world, has talked about this, and he says this is basically like pushing on a string. You can't just continue to lower interest rates and have it have the same effect as it did over the last 10 years, and you're going to eventually see that become ineffective. And so that is not going to be as powerful as it has been in reflating or stimulating the economy like it has in the last 10 years. So you're going to see central banks and governments get more creative with what they do with all that printed money. And you might see things like helicopter money, checks being written to, lower income or lower wealth tier families. You might see something like universal basic income be implemented. And so you'll have probably more cooperation between the governments and the central banks, which are usually separated and independent entities, work together to direct some of that stimulus into areas that they want. I'm not making any claims about the effectiveness or the morality of this. I'm just saying this is probably what you're going to see. So because of that, savers are losers. As you put money in the bank account, you're going to see the purchasing power of that be eradicated. $15,000 might be enough to give you, 4 months of expenses, spending power right now. If you wait a year or 2 years on that, that might not even be enough to pay for 1 month of living expenses as prices and costs of goods and services skyrocket in reaction to all the money that's being pumped into the system. And I recently did a video on universal basic income and the fact that because of all the inflation that will bring about, how that will probably impact the poor people the hardest. Because when inflation happens, it's the costs of goods and services that go up, and the revenues of companies that are producing those that will go up, and so the values of things like stocks and assets will be preserved a lot better than the value of cash. And poor people don't have assets, and so they only have cash. And so as costs skyrocket, you're going to see that stimulus have a smaller and a smaller effect on helping out the people who are in need the most. And so you can go check out that video. It's called, it's on this channel. I think it was the last video that I made. It's on universal basic income. So that's all I have for you today. The fact that savers are losers, and so minimize the amount of exposure you have to any paper currency. If you have your money invested in quality stocks, mutual funds, income producing, cash flow producing rental properties, real estate, and then commodities, precious metals, you're going to see your purchasing power and your value of your assets preserved a lot better than you will if you're holding something like bonds or cash. So don't be a loser, don't be a saver, invest instead. And thank you so much for watching. You guys have a great day.